Alright, you asked for it, you're getting it. This is a very detailed tutorial on how I make my button-down shirts. So some background information first. This is McCalls pattern 6044. I have altered this pattern to fit my body a little bit. It's also been resized from a medium to a 2XL. So it may look slightly different than what you're going to be using, but pretty much everything's the same. Now, you don't have to use this pattern. Most of what I'll be talking about is pretty general stuff. I just wanted to let people know that this is the pattern I'm using. So if you wanted to follow along exactly, there you go. Now let's talk about where I am at. First off, you notice that these patterns are not the paper pattern. I highly recommend if you're going to be using a pattern, you're going to be using more than like twice to just cut it out of a spare bit of fabric. This is just a cheap muslin that I use for pattern drafting. It's going to last you a lot longer. If you're working particularly cottons, I don't even need to pin this. That sticks to the cotton well enough. Saves me a ton of time. I don't have to worry about the pattern ripping. Highly recommend. Now, as far as the actual materials, for my shirts, I prefer 100% cotton. Typically, I just use quilting cotton just because shirting material is a little bit harder to find. This is a much lighter weight cotton than what I normally use. It probably is actually closer to a shirting weight. These are some of my other shirt materials. There's a batik. Love making these out of batiks. And then the most is just pretty much cotton from the quilting section. Of course, you don't have to use cotton. It's just what I find the most comfortable. For the most part, what I'll be saying is pretty much the same. If you're using a polyester, just be careful of your iron temperature, basically. Otherwise, it'll appear pretty much the same. Do not work in a stretch. Technically, you can, but I do not recommend it. What's nice about particularly cottons that because of the way the cotton is woven, there is actually a slight stretch this way, which is one of the reasons I kind of like this pattern for this, because it typically does fit on one of these 45-inch fabrics. This is a pretty wide one. The last one I made barely fit in there. As you can see, this one's fitting quite nicely. Because all my pattern pieces fit when it's just folded in half the lengthwise here with the salvages meeting, which is how it comes on the bolt. I don't have to do much. The pattern's going to be going the same way as long as all the pattern pieces are facing the same way up. That's an important detail. Don't forget that, particularly if you do have a pattern that has a direction like this one. Something like this where there is no direction, you don't have to worry. Or if it's like this one where the characters are in what's called a toss, and there's not really a direction, and then you basically just kind of pick which orientation. I'm partial to Winifred, so I'll probably be going this direction. The only thing that does matter is if you want that stretch to be going the same direction, you want to make sure that it's all kind of lined up that way. I recommend that. You technically don't have to, but it does make for a more comfortable garment if everything's stretching in the same direction. Plus, that'll help a lot with how things fit later on. Other than the fabric and some buttons, you'll need a lightweight interfacing. Can use a sew-in. I do a iron-on. This seems to make life a little easier. And then, of course, matching thread. Now, tips and tricks for this particular pattern. There's only one piece that needs to be on the fold. It's the back piece here. Everything else can just be laid however you want. A lot of them depend on the pattern. This pattern's random enough. I'm not worrying about it too much. I have a feeling I'm going to end up with the birds in kind of a weird place on the chest. If I was really persnickety, I do have the fabric. I could match it, but I'm not going to bother with that. I just do not care enough. The front piece has a little like front section where the buttons go. I like to line that right up and have it almost to the edge here. It doesn't always work, but that tends to be fairly good for making sure the pattern doesn't repeat in a funny way. I've done it many times. The pattern's like right here, because I was not paying attention. This tends to cut down on that. I talked a lot about the kind of what's and whys of fabrics. You will notice I've got some kind of weird gaps in my laying out. Normally I'd have these much closer together. This particular fabric is hand stamped. This isn't digitally printed like most cottons that you're going to find. And that makes it super cool, but it makes the pattern just ever so slightly off. And more importantly, it has weird overlap sections like right here. And I could include that, like, I don't want to. So I'm trying to avoid those sections. I always want to lay out all of your fabric pieces before you pin, before you start cutting especially. Because sometimes you'll have like weird lines in there. Sometimes you have holes. Sometimes there'll be a big blob. You never want to be caught off guard, because usually you can work around those things. It's also a really good example of why you always want to buy just a little bit more than what the pattern describes. Big projects, I usually add on an extra yard. For smaller ones like this, I usually add on about a half yard. This one was only sold in a big giant piece, which is why I've got all that extra. I'll find another project for it somewhere. Also, if you recognize this fabric, you excited for season 2? As I said in my other part, what I like about using this cotton on cotton is that it sticks together pretty well, so I don't have to use pins. But if you're using the paper version, or you're not working on a cotton, or it's just not sticking because it doesn't happen on everything, I tend to like to pin about every 6 inches or so around the edges of the pattern, particularly in the corners and in the middles. Anything that's got like a curve like that, a curve here, that curve there, I also like to pin because those are the ones that like to shift the most when you're cutting around them. Now, other than that, cutting is pretty straightforward. Just cut around the pattern. The only place that I personally cut notches out, because like the sleeve is pretty much symmetrical, so you don't need to know which side's the front and the back. You know, I think on a paper pattern it does distinguish that. I notch right at the center of this, just so I know where the center of the back seam is. Or else I notch the center of when I'm sewing it, which I'll get to when I sew it. If you're new to sewing, make sure you got an actual fabric scissors. Paper scissors will not do this job. It's a worthwhile investment. And of course, you just want to cut right along the edge of your pattern there. You want an exact copy. As I peel it away, you can see very little of that edge under the fabric underneath is showing through. That's how you want it to look. No point in having a pattern if you're not going to be precise in your cutting. Once it's cut, I just fold it and tie toss it up there and keep on going. Now I also want to make sure to cut out make sure you cut out one of each parts of the collar out of the lightweight interfacing. Typically what I do is I just kind of like fold it and cut a whole bunch of them at once. The stuff's so thin it is really kind of hard to cut just one layer. I just save them until I make the next shirt. Now I do not cut out the interfacing for the little button thing. I have never done that. At least I'm pretty sure that's what the pattern says. Never done it, never regretted not doing it. I recommend skipping it. All you really need to do is reinforce the collar. Now, the fun part about after you're done cutting, you can see how badly you screwed up the pattern. Yeah, I did exactly what I thought I was going to do. Bird tits. Which, again, this pattern repeats just enough that this would have been almost completely unavoidable anyways. Had I bothered to actually put the pattern in, this bird would have been just basically in my armpit. I don't know, I actually kind of like it. Bird tits for the wind. Be sure to crumple up your pattern and toss it in the corner for use later. Here's the back actually to prove that, like, had I even matched up the pattern, I'd still have bird tits. Where the hell came up with this pattern? It's so fruity. Next up, we're going to interface the collar, which means you have to pick out which sides of the collar you want to be seen. The sides you see are the sides you're going to interface. I like the flowers on this one, so I'm going to take this one. I like the flower in the center there. So I'm about to fuse on the interfacing onto my collar pieces. I believe this is a Pellon, whatever the heck this stuff is. I don't know if you can even buy these packets anymore. I buy it in bulk, so I don't remember what it is. But you're just going to follow whatever instructions that say on the back. Don't be an a-hole like me and just burn it. Assuming you followed the directions incorrectly and not did what I did, it should be nice and fused together and ain't going anywhere. Blah. Alright, so how I tend to like to sew, because I have attention issues, is that I like to pin everything all at once, or as much as I can, and then sew everything all at once, then pin all at once, and kind of do it that way. So I will not be following the probably directions that are in the actual pattern. It's been like a decade since I've read them. I don't even remember what they say. Usually I like to start out with the collar, no particular reason, I just do it. Lower section of the collar we don't need right now, so I just kind of tuck that away someplace safe. But for the outer part of the collar, the two pieces together with the right sides together. Now the shortest side is the side that's actually going to go inside of here. We don't need to stitch that. But the other three sides we do. So I'm going to pin those down. So just like that. Fold it up, put it to the side. I usually do the sleeves, so I just take one piece, fold it in half. I'll be stitching down this part that becomes the inner arm. So I pin that. Fold, place in the corner. Next is the front piece. We have to attach that center kind of button area. So you just take one half of the strip here, kind of line it up, and then we're just going to place it over the edge. I'll flip this around. How I pin big long pieces like this, I lay it out, kind of smooth it out, make sure that it like fits correctly. Keeping in mind that this piece is going to overlap slightly just because it's a downward curve. Pin each edge, pin the middle, and then I pin the middle of that, and then I pin the middle of that. That's how I get the most even results. It takes a little bit of practice. You won't get probably in your first try. But after you've done it a few times, you'll kind of get the concept pretty well. I'm going to fold that, and it goes in the sew pile. Of course, I'm always doing this to the other piece too. Everything's symmetrical in this pattern. Since there's nothing to do with the only other piece that's left, which is the back, we can start sewing. Everything so far is just a 5/8 inch seam, or whatever your equivalent would be if you're in a weird foreign country that doesn't do arbitrary dumb measurements like we do. Now remember I said you should have matching thread for your fabric? Guess what I didn't do? I gotta go into my stock and just see what matches the best. Here are my potential matches, so let's talk about matching thread colors. If you've ever been sewing, you know that very rarely we ever find a perfectly matched color. How I like to do it is unravel some of the thread and actually lay it directly on top of the fabric. Putting the spool up definitely changes it. Laying it on top of the fabric will simulate what a stitch will look like on top. So even though this one kind of matches the tone, when it's on top of the fabric, it's way too light, so I'm already taking that one out. This one's even worse. So we're down to these two darker ones. Now, I will say either one of these would probably work just fine. If you kind of squint, this one blends in a little bit better, which is usually how I pick. This one's kind of more of a hot pink vibe, though, so you could do it and it would just be a little more contrasty. Now, of course, the big problem is there's like nothing left on this one, and this is a very small spool. I don't think I'm going to have enough for either, but I'm going to try for this one, and we're going to see how far we get. I may end up having to make the buttonholes in this. We'll see. Fun fact about Gutermann thread, if you pull off this little bottom here, it undoes. You can actually store sewing needles in there. If I go to like a fair or festival or something and I have costumes, I usually include one of these with some needles in it. It's definitely come in handy. But enough about thread. Now it's time to actually start sewing. So this is just that upper collar section. Pretty simple. I am just literally 5/8 inch seaming it, just on, these three sides. Now, when I trim this, I personally like to cut kind of close to the seam. It really just depends on the fabric. If it's a very loose weave fabric, but this is just kind of right on the edge, I'll leave it a little bit wider, or I won't trim at all. The danger with trimming it so close is that there's a higher chance that the edges will fray. I've been wearing these shirts for many years. I haven't had it happen yet, but if you're really rough on your clothes, you may want to consider leaving the full seam allowance and just like trimming around kind of where these more curved parts are. However, no matter how you do it, you want to clip this corner, and normally you can just kind of cut like just the corner off. But because this is a greater than a 90-degree angle, you actually have to cut a little bit further in. You can kind of see where I've drawn about where I cut it. Make sure that you do not cut right at that edge. Leave a little bit, or else that edge will fray. So just like that, just enough that it's not going to pop out of the seam. And that's about where I trim it for the rest of it, the whole way around. Now I'm just going to flip it inside out. Now, to pop out those corners, this is a bad habit. I actually use my scissors and just kind of poke it. The edge of that scissors is almost the exact same angle. Don't do this with like a sharp scissors. Like I sometimes use these, and I have to be really careful with this because if it's too pointy, it will actually poke through the fabric or poke through your seam, and that's no fun. But I like that it pokes out. And then once I've got those corners poked out, get ready to press it. When I press it, I do what I call the finger wiggle. Because I trimmed that seam so close, I can actually just kind of wiggle it, and it actually pushes the fabric all the way up against to where the seam is. You can also do this just like with 2 fingers like this. And I can't do it while filming because I only have 2 hands. But basically just kind of press your seams along as you do that. And you get kind of a nice crisp seam where the seam's actually as far as it can go, and it's got the right shape and size and all that. And you have kind of a nice crisp shape. Now I've just pinned that open side closed. I'm going to stitch about 1/4 of an inch down. Technically this can be a basting stitch, but since it's just a little seam, I usually just do a regular one. Want to see my cool trick? So to avoid running over the pin, doing this one-handed, as I get before the pin, I actually take my finger, hook it on these large size pins, and pull it out. Woo, look at that. Just a real slick operation. Now before I get to the edge, I'll put my needle down into the fabric at about 1/4 inch to the edge, lift the presser foot, swing it around. I'm just going to top stitch the very edge at about 1/4 of an inch. Yeah, maybe it's 1/8 of an inch. I always just kind of eye it. This doesn't have to be a particular measurement. I find it just creates a really nice finished edge. Looks a little less kind of homemade, and it also helps the color to keep its shape a little bit. So there is that. Since I've got it here, I'm just going to finish up the rest of the color. So I fold it in half, and I'm going to clip a little corner, just a tiny little bit there, and that's going to signify the middle marker. If you're nervous about clipping seams, you could also just mark it with like a pencil or something. Now the bottom neck part of the collar, I'm going to put those 2 pieces right side together, and just those edges, the very tips of it, make sure that's all lined up, and again fold it in half. And then again, I'm going to clip that corner to signify where the middle is. Both my pieces now have that middle marker. I'm going to open up the bottom piece here, and the top piece actually goes inside. Just tuck it inside like it's an envelope. Pin all the middle so they're matching. Make sure it's all lying flat, and pin the edge. All that edge should match up. Make sure the edges are lining up, and you'll have it all pinned. That I have the 2 pieces of the collar all pinned together. Pretty simple, just another 5/8 inch seam allowance all the way around. Just the 3 sides, this open part stays open. Careful around those curves. You do want that to remain pretty even because it will show on the final product. And again, I'm going to trim it pretty close to the edge. Definitely do recommend trimming that seam because if you don't, I find that this middle collar section gets very full very fast. See kind of as we get further along, but it's just so much easier just to trim this and have it a little bit thinner. But after that, I just open it up again. And same thing, I'm just going to iron it all, making sure that the seams are as far open as they can be. I do not sew this bottom part closed. We will need that open later. But you can take this collar and put it off to the side for now. We will use that a little bit later. These are pretty simple, just 5/8 seam allowance. I will talk about finishing these seams a little bit later, but now you can just kind of chuck them off to the side. Boop. Now for this front little button patch on the front center of the shirt, make sure you're doing it to the center and not the side. This piece will not fit if it's on the side. Again, just 5/8 seam allowance straight down. And I'm going to take that, lay it down on my ironing board, and just flip this over. Just literally over. I'm basically just going to like comb over it with my iron. It's going to give me a really nice flat edge, and that's what I want. If you're like, there's a lot of ironing involved. Yeah, there is. If you're not ironing like every other step when you're sewing, you gotta start. It'll make a world of difference. Now on the bottom, make sure it's the bottom, and do kind of this weird fold thing where you kind of want to replicate that seam allowance in that sort of S, or I guess it's a Z shape. I'm going to try and draw this so it's a little more clear. So this is the regular front of the shirt. This is that front button piece. This is the part you've already sewn. And this is that piece of fabric that you're replicating in the same dimensions as the side of the seam. Probably just confusing you further. But I don't know how else to explain it. But once you do have it mirrored basically on both sides, you're just going to stitch 5/8 from the very edge to the other edge. So just like that. Now we're going to trim this as well. I'm going to clip this corner here. Again, leaving a little bit so it doesn't pop through. And then see this little weird flappy part? Just going to trim that down. That is what the final product should look like. I'm going to just flip it inside out. What that does is it just kind of combines that corner right into this nice little kind of package inside of this. Now back to ironing. So on the front button piece, I'm going to fold over this very raw edge, the piece that doesn't have the seam. I'm going to fold over and press 5/8 seam allowance. If you're having trouble figuring out how much that is, it is exactly the same as what we already stitched. So it should basically be symmetrical. You don't have to worry about this little bottom part. Just make sure the majority of it is folded over. And you're going to take it and you're going to fold it over. You're going to line it up right with that stitch line. And again, you're just going to press it all the way down. And this bottom piece should all just come together nice and neatly. Now, since you're already here with the iron, you can fold up the hem to 5/8 inches as well. The curve's a little tricky, but with some practice, you'll get it down. And then you're just going to tuck this in, going all the way into that little pocket, then iron that as you go. You don't have to do this, but I have found it makes it a lot easier when you finally do the hem. But we're not going to worry about that now. We're just going to stitch this front here. Now I just put a few pins here just to keep anything from shifting on me. Now I'm going to be top stitching again at about 1/8 of an inch or so, just along this very edge. I like to start with this inner seam here because it flattens down that the open side. Make sure that this side is fully closed, and then repeat on the edge. So I've got my front pieces all sewn up. This is my back piece, and this is the bottom hem, and I'm going to do that same thing where I fold it over. So it's folded once, and I'm going to fold it twice. And then with the back facing up, take your two sides of your front with the right sides together, and then pin the upper shoulder parts and then the sides, making sure to unfold if you did fold earlier, so you're stitching the entire length of the side. And then stitch all four of the seams at just 5/8 inches. Now we have to finish off the seams. First way is you just don't. This is not a method that I recommend, but technically you can. These edges will eventually fray, but they are very likely to unfray all the way to the seam. Another method is pinking shears. A lot of people have these in their handed down sewing kits. And these cut a kind of zigzag stitch there, and essentially it makes the fibers too short to kind of fully fray, so it for the most part stops fraying. This is not my preferred method. You can also do a French seam, which is too late to do that with these, but if you haven't started it, you can look up how to do a French seam. I think that's a little overkill, but I have seen it in some dress shirts. You can also flat fell, also I think a little overkill for these shirts, but that is the standard in quality shirt making. Actually what the shirt I'm wearing now is, and it's basically where you trim off one side of the seam and then take the other one and kind of fold it over and then stitch it down. It's a lot of work. I think it's just fussy. So I do the kind of lazy and slightly less respected way of just serging it. It does require a specialty machine, and it actually takes 4 pieces of thread. It does require specialty thread, and it uses 2 needles and a big complicated system in here to essentially kind of wrap the edge and then put 2 lines of stitching down, and that prevents pretty much every ounce of fraying you'll worry about. If you are going to be getting into sewing and you don't have one of these, I do recommend investing in one. They are very handy to have. They're a great way to finish off things cleanly and easily. Plus there's a few things you can do, like doing a really fancy rolled edge. It's great for working in shears. But yeah, so it's finishing off the edges of the sleeves, and then those 4 seams we sewed onto the bulk of the shirt. I forgot to mention it also has the ability to cut down these seams, so it cuts down a little bit of bulk. As you can see, that edge is pretty well wrapped, and now I don't have to worry about it. Now we press all those seams we just did. By the way, you are supposed to be pressing your seams, and the proper way to do that is to press it flat like this. The reason you want to do that is because it kind of sets the thread in and actually makes it a more stable seam. I never do it! That is technically how you're supposed to do it. For 2 reasons. 1, it just looks a lot better, and 2, it's just going to be a lot easier to figure out how the seams are supposed to lay if they're already laying in a very directional pattern. I tend to make all of my seams go in the same direction. That way that usually when they're in a spot where they link up, one goes to one side and the other goes to the other. You don't have to do it that way. That's just my preference. So while you're flattening your side seam, you can just kind of continue that roll. On the shoulders, I do like to flatten the seam towards the front. The reason that I do that when this sits on the shoulder, you're looking at it from the front, you're not going to see the seam as much because you're looking at the higher part of the seam, versus if you're looking at it where the bulk of the seam is on the other side, that seam is super noticeable. A very small detail, don't worry about it if you don't want to worry about it. It's also an important detail in vests. This one doesn't have it, so that seam is super noticeable. Now, we do the hem. And if you've ironed like how I have, and it's, cotton, so it's staying in place, you can literally just stitch it without having to do any pinning. Otherwise, just use your pins and do that double roll hem. I stitch very close to the edge here, so there's less to catch on when you're actually wearing it. So we've got the hem all finished. You can wait till the end of this, particularly if this is your first time making this pattern. It might be easier to kind of adjust the length. Although again, I recommend making this in just a cheap fabric out of a muslin, and then kind of adjusting the pattern from there. I would definitely not start it out on a real fabric. Anyways, the hem's done. I worry about the sleeve hems. Again, this might be one that's worth saving till the end, but this is where I find it easiest to do it, because hemming when there's not a bunch of other stuff attached to it is just easier for me. This one's pretty simple. It's just, again, a double fold rolled hem. I pin at the seam and at the opposite side, then right again in the middle, and I just fill it in as needed. I believe in the pattern it actually wants to do quite a wide one, which you can totally do. Actually how the pattern piece I believe is laid out. I've altered mine to not have to have that, but I like a slightly longer sleeve, and I found that this hem works just fine, so that's why I do it that way. Follow your heart. Alright, there it is, hemmed very close to the edge, like on the bottom of the shirt. Now I'm going to fold this in half, make sure everything's lined up, snip that corner to mark the middle, and then we are again going to put this off to the side. And in back comes the collar. I'm going to fold it in half, you guessed it, clip that to center. Now on the big piece of the shirt, remember we already clipped that center of the neck hole, so take it and with the wrong side facing up, take the inner face side of your collar and line it up. Then take the edge of the neck hole and line it up with the open end of your collar and pin it in place. And then again, just kind of go middle, 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 middle until the whole thing is pinned. And then making sure that this is open, you're going to stitch right from that edge all the way over edge with a 5/8 seam allowance. Making sure that it is going really from edge to edge. And also being careful that there's no tucks or folds or anything on either side. Go really slow on this. All right, just like that. And then I'm just going to kind of clip all the way around here, making sure not to go too close to that stitching, and that helps to kind of release the tension of trying to sew that circle into a straight line. You can kind of clip it before if you're struggling to get that circle onto the straight collar, but I found that because of the bias, it seems to be just fine without it. I also like to clip just a tiny bit of this corner, just because that corner gets really bulky, as you'll see in a second. But I make sure to not clip too much, because if you clip close enough, this will actually stick out, and it's a big mess. So be careful with it if you do decide to clip it. So now I've flipped everything over. You can kind of see it's wanting to kind of do what we need to do next. But first, I'm going to make life a little bit easier. I'm going to actually iron all this up, making sure that there's no folds in this seam. That'll stay a little bit more up when I'm trying to do this next part. So now I'm going to take the corners and kind of just tuck everything in. Basically just try and get it as flat as I can. The goal is you want to kind of line up the edge of this fabric where you're folding right up to that stitch line. I do it at the two corners and then right in the middle, lining up those little notches. And then I just kind of keep going. It's like how we did here, just to basically finish that seam. And that'll keep all of that stuff inside. And the last thing is I'm going to do the same thing to that top section there. Just like that. The only thing left in the actual construction is adding in the sleeves. And then I start with the side seam here. And I fold it in half. And then I'm going to mark that center point. And it will be different than the center seam. I believe in the pattern they actually have a marking to do this. This is just how I do it since I've altered my pattern. Take my sleeves with the right sides facing out. Match up those lower side seams. Match up those upper notches. And then basically I just have to pin it all in place. Now you're going to notice there's going to be slightly more fabric here than there is in the hole. So you're going to do what's called easing. I've got to get this amount of fabric into this amount of fabric. And it's just off enough that you can't just straight pin it. I believe the pattern wants you to do a stay stitch, maybe a gather stitch, I'm not sure. It's been many years since I've used the official pattern. Along this edge and use that to ease it in. I've never found success with that. I almost always get tucks. So instead, I just try and find a good middle spot. It's not too uneven on either side. Basically just kind of pull the fabric until it's even and pin as I go. Basically, whenever there's a fold, I just try and place kind of a pin right in the middle of it, essentially. Eventually it does even out, kind of a trust the process situation. Really worth your time to make sure that this is pinned really evenly, because if it's anything kind of off, it is going to show up in your stitching, and it's going to show up as a tuck. If you take your time and really kind of ease that in there, it should turn out pretty much okay. So now I'm going to sew it. Just another 5/8 seam allowance all the way around, starting where I stopped. I like to sew with the sleeve side facing up, just because that tends to be where most of the tucks happen, and I can have a little bit more control. And this does take time and practice and patience, so don't get frustrated if you don't get it right away. This is definitely the hardest part of the whole shirt. Alright, I didn't get any tucks. Cool. The point of that ease is that the sleeve is slightly larger than the hole. It creates a more natural fit. I'm just going to finish that off again with another serge, just like the other ones. Alright, the very last thing is buttons. I don't remember if the pattern comes with a button guide. If it does, you basically just put it up here and then just kind of mark where the button should be. I don't do that. What I actually usually do is just take another shirt that I've made and I just line it up. Then I use a pencil, but you can use whatever preferred marking method you have. I just literally mark inside the holes. As far as actually sewing the buttonholes, every machine's going to be a little bit different, so follow whatever instructions like your machine uses. Mine is an automatic buttonholer, so I just put the button in there, and it basically just kind of sews the hole for me. Basically, I just line it up, and so basically I just line mine up, and it just kind of goes. And then I just need to cut the actual buttonhole, which most people do with the seam ripper, but there are little weird chisel looking thing. I guess you could also probably use the scissors. I find this to be the easiest. This collar button is always the toughest just because it is the most material. Once the holes are cut, we have to mark where the buttons are going to go on the other side. I just lay it flat and then line up everything, especially this bottom here. Just like before, I literally just draw into the hole. And I know where to put all the buttons. These are actually women's blouse buttons. Men's have 4 holes. Technically, this would be a men's shirt, although I'm non-binary, so it doesn't matter. Most people don't even know that there is a difference. So just find a button you like. Now, personally, I like to quadruple my thread for buttons. I just find it goes a little bit quicker, it's a little more sturdy, and it leaves a bigger knot so it doesn't pull through. Now, I pull the thread so the knot is right in the center on the correct side. That helps create the shank for these non-shank buttons, and also makes it a little more pleasant looking on the back. Because my buttonholes are going this direction, I want my holes to be going that direction as well. So I pull my needle just to the bottom of that knot, up and through my button, and then back down on the other side of the knot. You don't want to pull it too tight, because otherwise the fabric won't be able to get around the button. Now in sewing, you want to do things at least 3 times. So I loop it at least 3 times, sometimes I do 4, for just these 2-hole buttons. And I pull to the front, not going through the hole one last time, and I'm going to kind of wrap it around those threads. That creates the shank as well as protects the threads. Do that 3 times, tie a knot 3 times, and that's how I do my buttons. So I'm just finishing up the buttons here. I get to show in the last part, because I have all the knots underneath the button, the underside is super discreet, much more comfortable. I never put a button where our skin can feel it. So now I'm just going to keep on making the buttons. My version of this shirt has 8 buttons. I think the pattern one has 7. I just decided I want my buttons a little bit closer. That I do is just towards the bottom here. I sew on 1 extra button so that in case I ever lose one, I've got one just attached to the shirt. So if I'm traveling or I just lose my little button bag, I've always got it. But sometimes it's really hard to find buttons again, and sewing on 1, it's already sewn on here. It's a lot easier than having to replace them all. But otherwise, it's done. And there it is. It's my bird tits. And I do like the contrast buttons. I think it complements the fabric very well. Some other side notes, when you iron this, I always start with the collar. That's definitely the most important part to stay flat. The other big thing is the buttons. This little front section, I always iron that, make sure that stays flat, and then kind of the bottom hem, because that can kind of roll up. And once a fabric like these woven cottons get a crease in them, that crease likes to just stay there forever. So making sure that you're always ironing after every single wash helps to decrease that happening, helps to prolong the life of the fabric, and just makes it look better. So there.